seated.
The court will now hear the case of the IMT versus Julius Streicher, led by Associate Chief Justice Lauren Altman.
We will now hear the prosecution's opening statement. Please approach the stand.
Good evening, honored members of the court. I'm here today to present the case that Streicher is guilty for crimes against humanity, crimes that ultimately form the foundation for the mass persecution and eventual incitement of genocide against the Jewish people in Germany and the territories occupied by Nazi Germany during the war. As the evidence will demonstrate, Streicher did not use traditional weapons of war against the Jewish people. His most effective weapon was propaganda. Through the newspapers and journals and spoken speeches. Streicher devoted himself during his 25-year association with the Nazi Party to using his positions, resources, and ability to communicate directly with the German citizens, almost nonstop for a single purpose: the manipulation and incitement of Germans to fear and hate Jews, to a level that would ultimately bring about the destruction of their communities and end in their near total extermination. The prosecution will demonstrate that Streicher's relentless, well-documented efforts were unfortunately very successful and facilitated the persecution and murder of millions of Jewish men, women, and children. Streicher's original connection with the Nazi Party dates back to 1921. One of his few official roles was appointed GAL leader of Franconia in 1925. In this position, while serving in his official role, Streicher's persecution and physical abuse of innocent Jewish civilians in the district, often with a riding whip, was well known. And according to 1757, even the Nazi Party concluded that, quote, GAL leader Streicher likes to beat people with riding whips, but only if he's in the company of several persons assisting him. Usually the beatings are carried out with a sadistic brutality, end quote. Streicher also served as a member of the Reichstag and was an Obergruppenführer of the SA. Streicher, through his decades of involvement with the anti-Semitic teachings, understood very early on the importance to the Nazis of convincing German people of all ages to hate Jewish people and support their annihilation. According to M12, Streicher stated in a speech as early as 1924 that Adolf Hitler, quote, possessed the courage to attempt to free the German people from the Jews by national revolution, end quote. He followed the statement in another speech in 1925 by declaring that, quote, for thousands of years the Jew has destroyed the nations. Let us make a new beginning today so that we can annihilate the Jews, end quote. And that quote was taken from M13. Streicher spent the next 20 years using hate-filled propaganda in his speeches and writing to incite the German people to support and carry out the complete destruction of the Jewish people. Streicher was the editor and publisher of the Der Stürmer from 1922 until 1933. And in 1933, he became the owner of the paper. He also published a daily newspaper and several other local newspapers and journals over the years. All of these papers, particularly the Der Stürmer, were used to spread on a daily and weekly basis anti-Semitic propaganda intended to cause the German people to fear and hate Jewish people. And according to M36, Streicher would regularly describe the Jew as a, quote, parasite, an evildoer, a disseminator of diseases who must be destroyed in the interest of mankind, end quote. One of the ways Streicher worked to turn the German people against the Jews was with ritual murder propaganda. Streicher took a medieval belief that Jews murdered Christian children and falsely represented it in his newspaper that Jews were committing ritual murder in Germany at the time. For example, according to 2699 PS, in April of 1937, publication of the Der Stürmer includes a photograph entitled, quote, Ritual Murder of Agnes Herza by the Jews Erdmann and Westermann, taken from a contemporary postcard, end quote. That is alleged to represent Jews ritually murdering a young girl and draining her blood into a bucket. Another article in the Der Stürmer found in 2699, also from April 1937, describes a feast that is supposed to occur among Jews following a ritual murder. That includes drinking a mix of bread and blood from the murder. During the feast, the article claimed that the head of the Jewish family must say, quote, may all the Gentiles perish as the child whose blood is contained in the bread and wine, end quote. By these writings and articles, Streicher manipulated the people of Germany into believing that Jewish people were evil, bloodthirsty people who have given the opportunity to kill their children. These pictures and articles appeared throughout the years in newspapers controlled by Streicher and were intended to incite the German people to take action and seek revenge against the Jews. Streicher attacked the economic interests of the Jewish people and encouraged all Germans to do the same. On April 1st, 1933, Streicher led the first official action of the Nazi Party once it came to power by organizing a boycott of Jewish businesses. Streicher announced that the boycott in his newspaper under the heading, quote, "Defeat the Enemy of the World" by Julius Streicher, official leader of the Central Committee to combat the Jewish atrocity and boycott campaign, end quote. The goal of this boycott was to begin the process of destroying the economic base of the Jewish community and would continue as a form of persecution throughout the Nazi regime. Streicher also used his newspaper to publicize mass anti-Jewish demonstrations, like those that occurred in November of 1938. Streicher took a central role in these demonstrations, which resulted in the destruction of Jewish synagogues and the Aryanization of Jewish property to the state. Streicher manipulated the people of Germany throughout the years with his writing, but also through his speeches that declared Jews deserved to be exterminated. In one speech I found, which was in M6, Streicher informed a crowd of Germans with the extermination of the Jews as the ultimate goal. Quote, "He who helps to bring this about helps to eliminate the devil, and the devil is the Jew," end quote. Even in the earliest days of the Nazi Party, Streicher stated in a speech in 1924, after declaring the Jew to be the enemy of the German people, that, quote, "I bear within me the knowledge that the whole misfortune was brought to Germany by the Jews alone," end quote. Streicher did not limit his attempts to manipulate and exploit the German people to adults. He also focused on inciting the German youth to despise the Jewish people. He published anti-Semitic children books through the Der Stürmer, depicting Jews as an evil character who German children should fear, and including references to Jews as torturing Jesus Christ. He also published a book for teachers and children that emphasized the need for anti-Semitic teachings in schools throughout Germany. The introduction of this book from M46 reads, quote, "No one should be allowed to grow up in the midst of our people without this knowledge of the monstrous character and dangerousness of the Jew," end quote. Streicher was also fully aware of the persecution Jews were suffering in other parts of Europe and understood that his writings were impacting people's treatments of Jews outside of Germany. In 1943, he stated that, quote, "It is really the truth that the Jews, so to speak, have disappeared from Europe, and that the Jewish reservoir of East, in which Jewish plague has for centuries beset people of Europe, has ceased to exist. However, the foyer of German people at the beginning of the war was prophesied what has now come to pass," end quote. And this quote can be found in 1965 PS. Streicher even went as far as to blame Jewish people for high casualty events that occurred outside of Germany, like the Hindenburg disaster. He wrote in the Der Stürmer that, quote, "The first radio picture of the United States of America shows quite clearly a Jew standing behind the explosion of our airship Hindenburg," end quote. Honored members of the court. Ultimately, Streicher's devotion to the Nazi Party and Adolf Hitler was only matched or possibly exceeded by his hatred of the Jewish people and everything they stood for. Streicher believed that the ultimate success of the Nazi Party depended on the total annihilation of the Jewish people, and he devoted his life's work to infecting the minds of German people with a hatred strong enough to bring about their mass persecution and murder. For these acts, the prosecution will prove that Julius Streicher is guilty for crimes against humanity.
We will now hear the defense's opening statement on behalf of Mr. Streicher. Defense, please approach the stand.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen of the court. Greetings to the justices. I am the defense attorney, Julius Streicher, and I stand before you to explain why he should be found not guilty on his charge of crimes against humanity. Streicher's main crime was the publication of his newspaper, Der Stürmer. Through this publication, he shared his beliefs, stories regarding said beliefs, and rants regarding Jewish people. However, it can be argued that this act itself is not a crime, and that to charge Streicher as such is a violation of protections against free speech. In the case of Gitlow v. New York, held at the United States Supreme Court in 1925, the U.S. First Amendment was used to heavily defend Gitlow. Within it, the First Amendment was used to say that freedom of speech and of the press are among the personal rights and liberties to those under U.S. law. By publishing this newspaper, Streicher did not violate any of these liberties granted to him. Within the opinion published in Gitlow, it was stated that the U.S. does not penalize the utterance or publication of abstract doctrine or academic discussion, having no quality of incitement to any concrete action. It can also be stated that decisions of the Nazi Party aren't at the fault of Streicher himself. Der Stürmer was not even a party organization. It was a privately owned newspaper over which parts Nazi Party members had no control over. The official publishing house was the central publishing house of the NSDAP, run by Franz Becker's successor. What was taken from or acted upon from these articles was the choice of the readers and not his fault. Party changes, and in turn, the final solution cannot be traced back to Streicher. Rather, to those who actually had a say in the meeting and proposals that led to this outcome. This brings me to my next point, Streicher's position within the party itself. He was a member of the Reichstag and of the NSDAP. Neither had much significance. The Reichstag was almost completely ceremonial under Hitler's dictatorship. Majorities of the decisions and plans of the Nazi Party were made by Hitler or those close to him, but Streicher was not. Streicher was far removed from Hitler's personal circle. In fact, he had an honorary position of Obergruppenführer within the SS, meaning he was never actually going out and dictating how the Jews would be persecuted. His highest ranking position was Gaul leader of Franconia, which was held from 1925 to February of 1940. He was removed from this position before a majority of the killing associated with the Holocaust happened. Any decisions made during this time would have little impact on the killing itself. However, Streicher was in charge of one official Nazi event, the Jewish War boycott, spring of 1933. Streicher set out with the goal to get other German citizens to boycott businesses owned by Jewish people. However, in his publication showcased in document 2154-PS, the guidelines outlined in both violence against both store owners and customers was to be avoided under all circumstances. To help prevent further violence, it was established that entering of these businesses by SA or SS members was strictly forbidden. Patrons of these businesses and shops could ignore all posters and guards and simply go about their day. Any actions of violence committed by other Nazi members cannot be blamed on Streicher, as no signs or publications were made to tell people to take any of these actions, and they came directly of the person's own volition. In following the trend of nonviolence regarding Streicher's solutions, the same can be applied to his ideas of the final solution. Prior to the Holocaust, which Streicher wasn't present and planning to have any say in it, it can be stated that Streicher's solution was not necessarily one of death or persecution. Rather, he envisioned a Germany without Jews, which could have been committed nonviolently. And while we can ponder what could have happened versus what actually did, we can state as such. The persecution and systematic murder of Jews cannot be equated to the publication of propaganda and anti-Semitic newspapers. Der Stürmer did not directly state to murder, kill, nor act violently against Jewish citizens. Articles written by the publication did speak ill of Jewish citizens, though it did not force anyone to act upon the prejudices instilled by the publication and the greater Nazi Germany. Therefore, Julius Streicher should be found not guilty of crimes against humanity due to his protections of free speech, the fact that Der Stürmer was not an official party paper, his lack of influence, and that he once advocated for nonviolence. Thank you.
We will now hear the defendant's plea. Mr. Streicher, you may begin.
Ladies and gentlemen, I, Julius Streicher, am innocent. I was a member of the Nazi Party, the Gauleiter of Franconia, and a member of the Reichstag. I am also the editor-in-chief and publisher of the daily newspaper Der Stürmer. My intention within my work was to share my beliefs and stories amongst the German people. Although I produced what may be considered questionable articles and pieces in my newspaper, those pieces were published legally and were strictly my beliefs that were not forced upon anyone to follow. I plead not guilty to the charge of crimes against humanity. I was exposed to the anti-Semitic beliefs as a young boy, which greatly affected my life today. I was surrounded by strongly Catholic families as well as my own. My mother taught me to be disrespectful to Jews, so I did not know any better growing up. Having been taught these beliefs, I grew up under the impression that I should follow them later in life. However, publishing my beliefs was not to gain a following, but to share what I thought was right. In 1904, I became an elementary school teacher and greatly cared for the children I was teaching. The village priest mostly had control of what I taught. I was constantly supervised and hardly had the opportunity to teach the children more than anti-Semitic views. The priest would ensure that I was teaching anti-Semitism to the children, even though there was much more to learn. Having to teach these views also factored into my beliefs for the future. In 1923, I founded the daily newspaper Der Stürmer. I published my personal beliefs and stories. I did not commit any crimes. I have the right to free speech, and I used it. Whether or not the articles I published were wrong and hurtful, they were not illegally published. I had the right to own a newspaper and publish my thoughts. I find it unbelievable that others think I violated my right to free speech, when that is not the case. I had the right to write those articles as they were my personal stories and what I believed. I am not responsible for how people interpreted my writing. Others have the choice to agree or disagree with my opinions. I had no intention to create a massacre. I only wanted to share my views with the citizens of Germany. Even then, it was up to the readers of my articles to decide what they wanted to believe and what they were going to do with those beliefs. I have no responsibility for their actions once my articles are read. In 1933, the boycott of Jewish businesses occurred. Now, I will not deny being in charge of this act, but I will state that I had no intention of promoting violence. The Jewish boycott of 1933 was the only anti-Semitic event that I was in charge of. I greatly discouraged violence during this time, as I do not believe violence was the answer to the problem. I found it important to avoid acts of violence during the boycott, as I was only hoping their businesses would no longer continue. Therefore, I am not responsible for the physical harm that came to Jewish people during this event. As I mentioned before, I was a member of the Reichstag under the dictatorship of Hitler and a member of the NSDAP. Even though I was considered a part of these parties, I was of low rank in the system. Any ideas I had would be sifted through all of those of higher rank than me in the party. Considering my rank in the party, I had little to no impact on the ideas of the Nazi Party. For that reason, I should not be held responsible for the violent acts that the Nazi Party committed. As Gauleiter of Franconia, the decisions I made were of little to no effect on the Holocaust that would later take place. I only held this position for a short time, and I was not in close relations with the Fuhrer. Holding this position did not make my ideas the ideas of the Nazi Party. I would like to state that I had no direct involvement in the Holocaust itself. I did not engage directly in the murder of the Jews, thus making me not responsible for the millions of deaths of Jewish people during the Holocaust. I find it shocking that I am accused of this crime, considering I am not personally involved and that I had the right to free speech when publishing my newspaper, Der Stürmer. I hope you all can see that I should have never been accused of these vicious acts, and that I should be declared not guilty of crimes against humanity.
We will now begin direct examination. Defense, please approach and stand.
What are your publications in Der Stürmer consist of?
My publications in Der Stürmer consisted of my personal beliefs and stories.
And what was the opinion of Der Stürmer within the party?
Not many people within the Nazi Party liked Der Stürmer.
Now this may sound elementary, but did you have many friends in the Nazi Party?
No, not many people within the Nazi Party liked me or listened to me due to them thinking that I had much more radical views than them.
Yeah, right. Then what exactly was your role within the party?
I was a member of the Nazi Party and a member of the Reichstag. I was appointed Gauleiter of Franconia. However, I was stripped of these positions in 1940, and I also held a purely honorary position in the SS.
Why did you try to prevent violence during the World Jewish boycott?
I tried to prevent violence because I think killing people is wrong. I did intend to have the Jews out of Germany, but I did not intend to have them killed.
Now, did the spreading of propaganda directly mean that you intended to kill all Jewish citizens in Germany?
No, I had no intention of killing any Jewish citizens in Germany.
Did you plan the Holocaust?
No.
Did any of your ideas directly cause the Holocaust?
No, none of my ideas directly caused the Holocaust, nor did any of the ideas from the Holocaust come from me.
All right, one last question. Is it fair to be held liable for the actions of others?
It is not, because I was not directly involved in the Holocaust, therefore making me not responsible for the acts of those who were involved.
Thank you.
We will now begin cross-examination. The prosecution, you may begin.
Mr. Streicher, you joined the Nazi Party led by Adolf Hitler in 1921, correct? Yes or no? Even in the earliest years of the Nazi Party, you were already speaking publicly to the German people about the need to free Germany of the Jewish people by annihilating them, correct? Yes or no?
I don't recall saying that I wanted to annihilate them.
In fact, in 1924, you stated in a speech that Adolf Hitler, quote, possessed the courage to attempt to free the German people from the Jew by national revolution, correct? You were appointed Gau leader of Franconia in 1925, correct?
Yes.
As a Gau leader, you governed and had complete control on behalf of the Nazi Party over the Nuremberg district until February of 1940, correct?
I don't believe I had complete control as my actions had little effect.
But you had complete control over the district through your role in the party. Thank you. Isn't it correct that while serving as Gau leader, you were accused of persecuting and abusing Jewish citizens of the district, often with a riding whip?
I did harm the Jewish citizens, but I
Yes or
never
no,
killed
please?
anyone.
Yes. In addition to your official roles with the Nazi Party, you served as the editor and publisher of the Der Stürmer from 1922 to 1933 and became the owner of the paper in 1933 and published several other daily newspapers in general over the years, correct? In fact, these papers regularly published articles describing the Jew, as I directly quote from the Der Stürmer, a parasite and evildoer, a disseminator of diseases who must be destroyed in the interest of mankind, correct? You were also focused, Mr. Streicher, on destroying the economic foundation of the Jewish community. Isn't that correct? On April 1st, 1933, you led the first boycott organized by the Nazi Party against Jewish businesses and announced this boycott in your newspaper under the heading Defeat the Enemy of the World. Is that correct? In addition to the boycotts, you also supported and led mass anti-Jewish demonstrations publicized in your newspaper, like the one that occurred in November 1938 that resulted in the destruction of Jewish synagogues and the seizure of Jewish property by the Nazi state, correct?
I did harm Jewish synagogues, but not the people.
Well, yes or no? Did you or did you not destroy Jewish businesses and synagogues? Yes or no?
Yes.
Isn't it also true that you published a book for teachers and children that emphasized the need of anti-Semitic teachings in schools throughout Germany, that including an introduction that read, "No one should be allowed to go up in the midst of the people without this knowledge of the monstrous characters and dangerousness of the Jew"? Yes or no?
Yes, but by the environment that I was surrounded in.
Sir, I don't have enough time for you to explain. The fact is, Mr. Streicher, you manipulate the people of Germany throughout the years with your writing, but also through your speeches that consistently declare Jews deserve to be exterminated. In one of these speeches, isn't it correct that you informed the crowd of Germans that, quote, "He who helps to bring this about helps to eliminate the devil, and the devil is the Jew"? Did you say that, yes or no?
I don't recall saying that.
Okay, well, as proof, I referred the court to document M6 in the evidence. Also, ultimately, you were also fully aware of the persecution of Jews that were suffering in other parts of Europe and fully understood that your propaganda was intensifying the persecution of Jews outside of Germany. Isn't that correct that in 1943 you stated, quote, "It is really the truth that the Jews, so to speak, have disappeared from Europe and that the Jewish reservoir of the East from which the Jewish plague has now for centuries beset the people of Europe has ceased to exist. However, the flare of the German people at the beginning of the war prophesied what has now come to pass." Did you say that? Yes or no?
I only had knowledge of them disappearing.
Well, I'm saying, did you say that? Yes or no?
Yes, I did.
What you spent 25 years working relentlessly day in and day out, hoping you would, quote, "come to pass," was the total extermination of the Jewish people. And what did, quote, "come to pass" as a result of your actions was the murder of millions of Jewish men, women, and children. Isn't this correct, Mr. Streicher?
Can you repeat the question?
I said that, are you aware that your relentless efforts led to the murder of millions of Jewish men, women, and children? Yes
I
or no?
don't think I'm directly involved.
Mr. Streicher, In furtherance of your efforts to demonize and cause the German people to fear Jews, you regularly publish distorted and false stories of ritual murder to German children committed by Jews, correct? Isn't it correct, for example, that in April 1937, publication of the Der Stürmer included a photograph that is alleged to represent Jews ritually murdering a young girl and draining her blood into a bucket, while another of the same describes a leader of the Jewish family feasting on the blood? Is that true or false?
But I only wrote
All of these papers, particularly the Der Stürmer, were used to spread on a daily and weekly basis anti-Semitic propaganda intended to cause the German people to fear and hate the Jewish race, correct? Okay. That's all.
The tribunal will now begin questioning. Mr. Streicher, you stated that not many people liked your publishes in Der Stürmer. Why is that?
not many people liked my publishing because they didn't really agree with my beliefs and did not want me part of the Nazi Party.
Could you let me know what type of responsibilities you had as being the Gauleiter?
As being Gauleiter, I was the district leader of Franconia, but my actions have little to no effect of the Holocaust related.
Could you explain a bit more in depth, like what responsibilities you had?
I was in charge of the district, basically.
Okay. Did you know that the Jews were disappearing? If so, or did you know that the Jews were disappearing?
I knew that they were disappearing, yes, but I didn't know how.
Okay. Were you involved in the steps that led up to Aryanization? I'm having trouble understanding that if you're truly innocent, why did you not stop promoting hate of the Jews to Germany once they started to get massively murdered? For example, in 1943, you stated that it is really the truth that the Jews, so to speak, have disappeared from Europe and that the Jewish reservoir of the East, from which the Jewish plague has for centuries beset the peoples of Europe, has ceased to exist. And the mass murders of the Jews began in 1933 after Hitler's orders.
Like I said before, I only had knowledge of them disappearing, and I used my right of free speech, and I thought that I am free to publish anything I want under the right of free speech.
Mr. Streicher, you have repeatedly said today that you don't support violence and killing. If you feel so strongly about this, why didn't you publicize that in your newspaper during the war when there was a lot of violence and killing going on?
I only really promote, I did commit acts of violence, but I did not commit any acts of killing, and that's why I published it in my newspaper.
One more question. Do you believe that abusing and hurting people is an act that should not be punishable?
Now I do realize that violence should not be used against people.
So do you think that it should be punishable?
I do not think I should be punished for the acts that I committed.
Okay. We will now hear the prosecution's closing statement. Prosecution, please approach the stand.
You have heard the evidence in support of finding Julius Streicher guilty of crimes against humanity, and that the evidence is overwhelming. It is evidence that was produced over a 25-year affiliation with the Nazi Party, that was filled with hatred for Jewish people, that was expressed directly with his own pen, with words from his own mouth, and through the whip he used with such, quote, sadistic brutality. The evidence established without a doubt that Streicher's actions and words were absolutely intended to form a foundation of hatred within the German people that would allow for a mass persecution and genocide against the Jewish people, both in Germany and the territories occupied by Nazi Germany during the war. And although the defense mentioned Streicher's position as Gauleiter was lost in the 1940s, before most of the murdering was done, this has no significance due to the fact that Streicher's work was done far before then. It was manipulation of the German population. And I find it very hard to believe that Streicher did not know why the Jewish people were disappearing. As the evidence demonstrated, Streicher's deadly weapon, which he used with vicious and murderous intent, was propaganda. This propaganda was written in newspapers and journals. He controlled like the Der Stürmer and spoke in speeches. It was used to inject hatred of the Jewish people directly into the minds of German citizens, nonstop, day after day and year after year. He praised Adolf Hitler in his newspaper for having the courage to, quote, free the German people from the Jew, end quote, and regularly called the German people to, quote, make a new beginning today so that we can annihilate the Jews. The evidence is clearly established, and we cannot ignore Streicher's words over all these years that sought the same outcome for all Jewish people: annihilation, extermination, and death. No other conclusion can be reached from his words to the German people, describing the Jew as a, quote, parasite, evildoer, a disseminator of diseases who must be destroyed in the interests of mankind. This hate-filled propaganda directed at the destruction of Jewish people was, as the evidence has proven, repeated constantly over Streicher's 20 years as editor, publisher, and owner of Der Stürmer and other newspapers and journals. Streicher was so determined to gain the support of Germans for the annihilation of Jewish people that the evidence clearly established that he used distorted and false stories of ritual murders and German children by Jews to cause fear and rage in the German people. These false narratives included stories of Jewish families feasting on the blood of German children and their parents, that they were not safe as long as the Jews were allowed to exist in German society again. Again, using propaganda to convince the German people that the total extermination of Jewish people was the only solution. Causing the German adults to hate the Jewish people for their support, the Jewish people and support their destruction was not enough for Streicher. The evidence proved that he published hate-filled anti-Semitic books depicting Jews as evil characters who Germans should fear and hate. He also published an anti-Semitic book for teachers that included an introduction that stated, quote, no one should be allowed to grow up in the midst of our people without this knowledge of monstrous characters and dangerousness of the Jew. Again, his hatred for the Jewish people and desire to see them destroyed was so strong that he did all he could to turn every man, woman, and child in Germany to an enemy of the Jews, an enemy that would ultimately support their extinction. Despite what the defense would have this court believe about Streicher's true intentions and the extent to which he had any impact on what happened to the Jewish people in Nazi Germany, the evidence is overwhelmingly clear. From the hate-filled propaganda to leading boycotts and demonstrations intended to destroy all aspects of Jewish community, Streicher's intent and ultimate role in the murder of millions of Jewish people is undeniable. He is guilty of using every position, resource, and tool at his disposal to spread hate-filled propaganda intended to convince the German people to support the extermination of the entire Jewish population of Germany and all territories controlled by Nazi Germany. Unfortunately, the evidence is also clear. Julius Streicher was very effective at poisoning the minds of German people with fear and hatred of the Jewish people. The murder of millions of Jews by Nazi Germany was, as the evidence overwhelmingly proved, facilitated by Streicher, and he is therefore guilty of crimes against humanity.
We will now hear the defense's closing statement. Defense, please approach the stand.
Julius Streicher should be found not guilty of crimes against humanity. To do so, he must have murdered, exterminated, enslaved, or deported Jewish citizens as defined by this charge. His writings were widely ignored, and to credit the entirety of this violence to him is a large and over-exaggerated statement. If the United States is to stay within the INT, which it does, it is only fair for it to follow U.S. law. This case should not be an exemption from the court, because if the tribunal prosecutes Streicher for a crime he simply did not commit, it would be a dangerous precedent for the future generations, as well as the lessened legitimacy of the International Court. Speaking ill of the Jewish people is not illegal. Streicher did not force anyone to act upon their prejudices. Since when has been illegal and punishable to share your opinion, regardless of how controversial they are? Is it fair to charge Streicher of the actions of others? When acting with others, how can you charge a man for a crime that so many committed? If you deem it fair and just to charge Streicher for sharing his opinions, you must also put on trial every single person who has done as such. Every single person who is racist with your own country. Streicher is not responsible for the actions citizens took in response to a legally published newspaper. Everyone has their own autonomy and the ability to make their own decisions. While the prosecution attempts to charge Streicher with spreading the propaganda, setting up the base of the Holocaust, Unfortunately, efforts leading of those would more likely fall under conspiracy. Mr. Streicher is not required to denounce the killing of the Jewish people, regardless of his stance on it. The simple fact is, while Streicher has spread propaganda and Jewish hate, he was acting within his limits of free speech. The response people had to his intense writing is not his responsibility, no matter the severity of it. Streicher isn't on trial for the content of his character, which he lacks, but on the crimes of the law. No matter what biases you have on your opinion and how you spread it, it does not break a law. I plead with you today to find Streicher not guilty from a man whom no one believed in and was often ignored.
The court will now debrief after hearing the prosecution and defense arguments.